Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's Sunday webinar. The topic that we are exploring is overcoming the pandemic of alienation. And I know that in terms of the topics that we have usually explored in this webinar, this is something that is more at a social level, at a community level, and it's a topic that where our individual needs, our individual motives, aspirations, and experiences merge into the collective whole and the potential fractures that can happen in that relationship between us and the other, whether the other is an individual, a group, a family, a community, or a nationality. So this topic is a very deep and interesting one that has been explored over several decades of systematic research. It has attracted the attention of economists. It has attracted the attention of psychologists, sociologists, existential philosophers, as well as people studying the effects of technology. So I decided to choose this topic because it appears so relevant in terms of what the American society or even the world is going through. As a result, some of the challenges that we had of modernity has been further exacerbated by the pandemic and so many other events that have affected our collective emotional well-being. So welcome to this seminar. I want to take a moment to personally thank each one of you who's joining us today from the bottom of my heart for making time to be with us today. So we start with overcoming the pandemic of alienation. And I'd like to meet the obligation of first explaining what the term alienation has meant. And while I explain it, hopefully, to give you an example or two that enables you to search in your own experience, where you may have, in your own lives, where you may have experienced the phenomenon of alienation. So one of the first meanings of alienation is powerlessness, a feeling that your destiny is not under your direct control. Most of us like to believe that our destiny is under our direct control, and we can make choices that will shape and affect the fundamental quality of our lives. Alienation is an experience where the connection between your choices and your destiny is kind of fractured or broken. So for example, you could be a great and wonderful contributor in an organization, but you might lose your job or get laid off, not because of anything to do with you, but because there was some development in the world of technology that made your job redundant, or perhaps a competitor emerged that put your company out of business. So a lack of agency, a lack of control over your own destiny, and the feelings of powerlessness is one of the manifestations of alienation. So I'd like you to ask yourself, where in my life do I experience powerlessness? The feeling that my life is not under my own control, but is determined by external agencies. That could be fate, that could be luck, it could be institutional arrangements, any of those. The second meaning of alienation is meaninglessness, where you're going through a day engaged in a variety of activities that don't necessarily make you feel like you're meaningfully engaged in anything. For example, you might have a very narrow job description that has you do a set of meaningless tasks, but you don't have any sense of how what you're doing is contributing to the collective well-being of the whole. So you don't see how your contribution is even connected to the things that you care about, that you're passionate about. And that sense of disconnection from your sense of purpose and meaning in life is alienation. So you may want to ask yourself, in what part of your life do you experience meaninglessness, where you don't necessarily feel that what you're doing is connected in a very grounded way to what your purpose in life is, to what you're passionate about, and to what you care about. The third meaning of alienation, one that we're all too familiar with, is the experience of social isolation, or a sense of loneliness, a sense of lack of closeness. It's an exclusion in social relationships. You don't feel an authentic connection. You almost feel like, although you might have a social life and a lot of interactions, they seem to be devoid of emotional authenticity, closeness, and meaning. And despite the explosion in social media, one of the paradoxes of modern life is that despite all the social media we have, we feel more lonely than ever. So that's the experience of social isolation. The fourth meaning of alienation is cultural estrangement, where somehow you feel that you don't belong to the group of people that you may find yourself with. How many of us have felt far removed from, let's say, the values even of our own immediate or extended family? That you feel a sense of removal, either from the values of those around you or from the broader society itself. For example, you could see, even among your Facebook activity, there were events that happened last year that solidified some friendships and threatened many other friendships. Our political identities. Sometimes you discover that the candidate that you want to vote for is somebody who's held in much great derision by somebody else who you thought you were close to. And then all of a sudden, this political divide starts permeating even your relationship with that person. How many of us discovered that on matters of race and the racial protests that happened, many of us held strong views, and we discovered that people that we thought we were close to had opinions or espoused views or values that were diametrically opposed to us. Without passing a value judgment, I just want you to connect with those experiences where you felt a sense of removal, a detachment, and a fracture between your values and those of the people that you primarily associate with. It can happen with your work groups, it can happen with your immediate family. Another meaning of alienation is normlessness. Emile Durkheim, the sociologist, talked about anomie. Normlessness is where society is going through a period of tumultuous social change. And you know that during periods of social change, the standards of what's considered acceptable behavior, the norms of what's considered acceptable conduct could start changing. They could be in a state of flux. So the norms that you adhered to have collapsed. There's a period of social change, and there's a temporary vacuum in terms of norms, and you feel completely lost and disoriented because of this vacuum. Finally, I have reserved the last for the best. The most powerful and difficult to treat, if you will, form of alienation. The sixth meaning of the term alienation is self-estrangement. It is a feeling that in one way or another, you're out of touch with yourself. So it's for each one of us to ask ourselves, where do we feel like there is a gap, a discrepancy, a gulf between our real self and our ideal self? Where do we feel that our original face, the real face that we have, original face is the term that the Zen masters would use, is so different from the projected face that we do, right? Often we are in positions where we are playing a role and we forget that it's just a role, and that becomes a mask. So for example, um, um, Osho talks about a person who was a judge in the court, but when he would go home, he would keep judging everybody because the role that he inhabited of judgment had become part of his identity, and he would carry that everywhere. Even being a professor, I have to watch out because I love talking, being a professor. Notice how, even on a Sunday, what am I doing? Being a professor. That's exactly what we have to watch for, where we take our roles so seriously that they become ingrained, they form a next layer of identity, and they give us an automatic way of being. Not that it is bad, but it's important for us to maintain that awareness of how the roles that we are playing tend to shape our perception of our life and how we act. Now, I want to give you a very brief but distinguished house tour of the different theories of alienation. To me, this is a very exciting journey that I'm going to take you on, because I'm going to talk about 5 different perspectives on alienation. So we are experiencing increasing levels of powerlessness, meaninglessness in life, social isolation and loneliness, cultural estrangement, normlessness, self-estrangement. Unfortunately, many of the sources of angst and anguish that we experience is reflected in drug usage. For example, with the opioid pandemic, where people have had to reach to drugs as a way of, medicating their own sense of disconnection and misery. Often, it results in us attaching ourselves to questionable political or social movements as a way of regaining a sense of identity that we have lost. It could also lead us, towards you abusing alcohol, towards suicide, and so many of the other collective public health disasters that we see an explosion of in the modern world. So it is important for us as we encounter this. How many of us have had family and relatives and close friends who have succumbed to one or another of these public health issues? So it's important for us, while often, we tend to look at things in a very individual frame of reference and try to solve our problems through individual choices. What this topic does is help us understand that while we are individuals, perhaps with freedom of choice, we are also part of larger structures. We have occurred at a certain point in history. So we are a product of our own history, of the history of our society. We are a product of our culture, and we are a part of something much bigger. And to understand what is going on in the bigger picture of society can actually help us in our own individual spiritual transformations. So I want you to listen to the 6 theories, not like this is an academic lecture on alienation, but to try for yourself as you listen to these brief descriptions to distill the essence and see, how can I understand my own situation better, my own interiority, my own internal world better from a discussion of these theories. So I want to start off with the economic theory of alienation, because the word alienation itself is attributed to Karl Marx. In his economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, he discusses the predicament of alienated labor. Alienated labor, and his belief was that under capitalism, the rich people, the owners of capital, own the means of production. There are a number of jobs that are not particularly meaningful, that are then outsourced or farmed out to poor people who are dependent on wages. So poor people will have to accept these jobs, because although these are not jobs that contribute to your self-actualization and to your inner growth, they're so robotic and meaningless. For the sake of earning a living, people then have to write off 8 and 9 hours of their day where they could be creative, instead to performing meaningless jobs, to being, which have nothing to do with their inner growth, with their inner disposition and their inner propensities. So, and then if the workers work extra hard, let's say that the workers quadruple the production, do you think they're rewarded for it? No, they'll be laid off, because the owner will then say, you know what, you guys are producing 4 times the amount that I expected you to, so I'm going to lay off 3/4 of you. I don't need you anymore. A quarter number of the remaining workers can suffice. So notice, says Karl Marx, that the product of labor, the fruits of labor, are used against the worker themselves. So this is the idea of the economic theory of alienation. Talks about the powerlessness that you could feel in these jobs, the meaninglessness that you could feel in these jobs, and how excessive specialization has led to very narrow jobs. So at best, says Marx, you will be a happy robot at work, because you would have numbed your appetite for creative work, for self-actualization, for self-expression to such an extent that just collecting a paycheck for the meaningless work that you do is enough. So in roles where there isn't much intellectual stimulation, where you don't see the connection between your primary commitments in life and the responsibilities that you're performing. A slight variation of the economic theories of alienation was present in Erich Fromm, if you remember, who fused Freud with Marx to develop his own conceptions of what's happening in modern societies. Just as an example of his theorizing, I would like to talk about the marketing personality orientation that he discusses, where because of modern society and the emphasis on marketing, so many of us are concerned about our image. For example, even in trying to spread these news about these webinars, the question I'm asked is, what is your brand? How are you branding yourself? Erich Fromm would say that is a very tragic state, that in this society, human beings can no longer be people. They have to reposition themselves as products, as brands. So something that you offer is now a brand. So you've moved from the realm of the thou, which is you as a human being, to the realm of the it, which is a product. And this marketing personality orientation colors so much of what we see. So those are the economic theories of alienation. I'd like to next transition to the psychological theories of alienation. And I want you to marvel at how the psychological theories are looking at alienation from a completely different perspective. The economic theories take powerlessness and meaninglessness and all of that and look at it in the context of capitalism. The psychological theories build on the contributions of Sigmund Freud, and they say that powerlessness, meaninglessness, and all of these experiences are a result of the fact that human beings are driven by unconscious motives, that they have no knowledge of these motives, that human beings are driven by unconscious motives. They may rationalize these motives. We might think that I'm making decisions based on my executive mind, which is the conscious, rational mind. But the reality is several unconscious motives may be driving me. For example, could it be that these webinars that I'm doing, which consciously I'm going to say, you know what, I'm passionate about spreading Eastern wisdom traditions and applying them to contemporary problems. Yes, I'm passionate about it. But a psychoanalyst might ask, is it possible that this is your attempt to gain the attention and to become lovable because you didn't feel you got enough attention as a child or that you were lovable? So many of our behaviors, overt behaviors, are driven by hidden motives that are like the hidden part of the iceberg. And so to Freud, it is these unconscious motives and the fact that 90% or more of our behavior is driven by these unconscious motives, that we are out of touch with who we are at the deepest level. We experience powerlessness because I may want to do something, but I do something totally else because of an unconscious impulse that takes over me. And we experience meaninglessness because my unconscious mind will throw me into making decisions and taking actions that don't really, honor or nurture my deepest needs. So for example, Freud talks about in the paper Neuropsychosis of Defense, he listed a variety of defense mechanisms, displacement, and we've talked about it in the past, right? Like your boss yells at you, you go yell at your significant other who yells at the child who then kicks the dog. So there are so many unconscious ripple effects, the domino effects, and all these unconscious motives are creating a social, familial, emotional context in which we feel totally powerless and meaningless. The next branch of theories is the existential philosophical theories. And notice again how they approach alienation from a totally different perspective. They're not concerned with the economic organization of society. They're not concerned with the unconscious motives in human behavior. The existential philosophical view of society says that alienation is inevitable. It cannot be escaped because it is inherent in the nature of man's existence in the world. It is inherent in the nature of man's existence in the world. You and I are thrown on this planet at the point at which we are born. We didn't ask to be born, but we are suddenly thrown on this planet. And then you're born into a country, into a nation. Do you have a choice whether you want to be born as a Britisher or an American? No. All these countries are already set. Everything is established. So you come into this world, you're thrown into this world, you're powerless, also because you're constantly vulnerable and fragile. The pandemic was just a reminder of how fragile our existence is, through COVID-19 and all of this. But the vulnerability, the threat of non-being or the threat of death is forever present. From the time you wake up in the morning, you could die anytime. And so there's a tremendous amount of what they call ontic anxiety about our existence that is never conscious, but is unconsciously following us through our existence, that the world is essentially devoid of meaning and purpose. And in a world devoid of meaning and purpose, it's hardly surprising that you will feel unrooted, vulnerable, fragile, anxious, meaningless, and powerless. Now, there are various existential philosophers who have contributed to refinements of this understanding. For example, Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and through his experiences in a concentration camp, would say that those people who find meaning and purpose in life, who commit themselves to active choice, to something much bigger than themselves, and who are in sync with that sense of meaning, are more likely to transcend the condition of alienation. Martin Buber, the existential theologian, would probably say that if you are able to establish more I-thou relationships, person-to-person relationships, as opposed to I-it relationships, where you're treating other people as objects to be manipulated and controlled, you're more likely to or transcend alienation. Hegel is known for his classic dichotomy that man exists as a subject and as an object. and which leads to what Sartre says, the other is hell, meaning that another human being, just by the way they look at you, can demean you, can literally kill you, right? So in that sense, existentialists are talking about, it's actually almost like giving expression to what Kansas, the band, have talked about in the song Dust in the Wind. Dust in the wind, all we are is dust in the wind, dust in the wind, everything is dust in the wind, is an experience of existential distress. Next come the sociological theories of alienation, and they have a very interesting take on what's going on for us. They say that it's the demise of the little community, that we lived in villages and towns and little communities where everybody knew each other. Now, in the little communities, the nature of the relationships that you have are called primary relationships, like in a family. They're direct, face-to-face, they're unconditional. Most family relationships are unconditional, right? But at the same time, most of the secondary relationships are those that we have in our companies, in our firms, in our organizations, that are contractual and conditional. You're here to fulfill a job description, and when you've failed to satisfy your part of the contract, you leave. You're fired. They're very transitory and temporary. The urban metropolis is one where there are large crowds. Go to the downtown of any city, large numbers of people, New York City, the subways, and all of that. But are we connected? The mere presence of people around us can actually make us even more acutely aware of our loneliness. In fact, the sociologist David Reisman talks about lonely in a crowd, and how we could feel a tremendous loneliness because the people and the relationships that we have are devoid of intimacy. The sociologists have also used the term mass society to contrast the traditional societies that were smaller. In mass society, you're part of a large urbanizing mass, and you're feeling completely disconnected. And many sociologists like Daniel Bell have talked about how we will often follow irrational political leaders, political movements, religious movements, social movements, just because they give us a greater sense of belonging. So often charismatic leaders and secular messiahs will bestow upon us, as he says, the fullness of grace to make us feel whole and complete. And we fall prey to various kinds of predatory social movements around us, in the context of an impersonal urban metropolis. Finally, the fifth theory of alienation are the technological theories of alienation. Shoshana Zubank wrote a book called The Age of the Smart Machine. It's the idea that modern society resembles a machine. Our institutions are run like machines. Gareth Morgan talks about images of organization, that every company we work in is like a machine. There's an input, there's a code transformation process, there's an output. So if you are working as part of a large machine, who do you become? As a corollary, you become a cog in the wheel of a highly specialized machine operating as a subdivision of a bureaucratic function. And therefore, modern technology has deracinated man, people say, depriving him of his sense of identity, chaining him to a treadmill, and trapping him in a depersonalized, regimented, and over-organized society. And as somebody said, the voice of the romanticist, pleading for a return to much simpler forms of living, is found to be very persuasive. So part of Louis Mempher, Jacques Roussel in France, and others talk about the alienating effects of modern technology. Technology is highly predictable. And because technology is so predictable, we fall into the trap of expecting people also to service with the same level of efficiency like machines. We want our children to be efficient in the way they do their homework. We want them to sit down, get it done, like a time and motion study. Whereas that leads to alienation, because people are people. They don't come to you like a nicely tailored suit ready to fit into your life, which causes a lot of misplaced expectations or category errors, as people call them. You start relating to people as if they're cogs in the wheel of a machine. Now that I've presented a fairly pessimistic picture of alienation, we want to spend the last 10 minutes talking about Eastern pathways to de-alienation. How do we de-alienate ourselves? How do we overcome those feelings of powerlessness, meaninglessness, social isolation, cultural estrangement, normlessness, and self-estrangement? Now, one of the primary differences between the existential philosophers of the West and the Eastern mystics is that the existential philosophers of the West would say alienation is a given. It is an irremediable part of man's existence. It is inherent in its finitude. It is inherent in the vulnerability and fragility of existence and the meaninglessness of life. Eastern mystics would say, we don't agree, that alienation is a sign of a fragmented consciousness, that through meditation, you can awaken to the unity of all beings. Excuse me. So, for example, if I were to just close my eyes and breathe in and breathe out and awaken myself to the sky of my own inner consciousness, if you close your eyes, you will feel an inner sky. And if all of us, the 25 of us, were to do this together, we would all be experiencing the silence of our own inner consciousness. And perhaps mystics would say, I might think that's my inner sky. Is there anything like a private inner sky? The sky is everywhere. We create addresses, like I think I'm living in a house, but this house is nothing other than a part of the sky that it has trapped. It has trapped a part of the Cleveland sky. Is it really even right to speak of a Cleveland sky? Is there a Cleveland sky? No, there's no Cleveland sky. The sky is one. In the same way, it isn't like my inner sky and somebody else's inner sky. We are all experiencing the pure ocean of human consciousness when we sit in silence, watching our breath, feeling the spaciousness within us. And in that moment, when we realize and understand the unity of all consciousness, you're no longer separate from each other. You are intertwined. Even the sun, if the sun chooses not to rise tomorrow, we would all be wiped out. We are all so interconnected. The trees outside my house are giving me the oxygen that I breathe. In so many ways, when we awaken to the interconnections of all of us and experience to that cosmic oneness that is our shared condition, we have overcome alienation. Now, the Osho was reminding us in one of the books that I was reading that we exist both as a circumference and a center. So this is me as a circumference. Most of the time, my circumference is all the external information you have about me. My center is my deepest inner reality. I exist with a deep inner reality, but I also exist with very many superficial layers, the clothes that I wear, the masks that I wear to protect myself, perhaps, the identity that I have as a college professor. All of this are the superficial and the social conversation that I engage in. Hi, how are you? How's the weather today? It's a little warmer today. Nice, isn't it? You know, let's go for a walk. And yeah, it'll be a wonderful day. And I'm waiting for hot, warmer weather. All these social, ritualistic conversations, I exist as a circumference. You exist as a circumference. Most of the time, when we think we're having human contact, it is circumferences touching other people's circumferences. Notice that the centers of the two circles are not touching at all. And this, to Osho, is the experience of alienation. And overcoming alienation means actually where our centers will touch each other. But how often do our centers even touch each other? Sometimes they touch each other. And sometimes it becomes so scary to be in the presence of another human being, experiencing that level of cosmic intimacy that we run. And then we again start interacting at this level of circumferences touching circumferences. What can we do to get beyond the circumferences, interacting at the circumferences, to reveal more of our inner center? There's a beautiful TED talk done by a freshman in a university. It's called, it has the word big talk in it, as opposed to small talk. Small talk is the social conversation that we engage in, to just keep the social ritual going. How are you and how's the weather? The big talk is really taking a risk to share something deep about ourselves. It might feel uncomfortable, but one of the things that happens when our centers start meeting in this way, and when the centers merge, is that it causes or unleashes a revolution of intimacy, where authentic self-disclosure on my part will lead to more authentic self-disclosure on your part, And soon there's a revolution of closeness and intimacy that can happen. It requires for me to be authentic and share what are the masks for first for me to be aware. Because if I'm not even aware of my inauthenticity, of how I'm trying to preserve an image of myself in the outside world and to trick people into believing that the image I'm projecting is really who I am, if I'm not even aware of that level of self-deception, how can I enter into authentic relationships with others? So the first breakthrough is in terms of being aware of my own duplicity and self-deception. And it's a very paradoxical awakening when I can see the masks that I'm wearing, when I can see how I'm being a con man in every relationship, trying to preserve an image. In that instant of being open to the bad news about myself, I have transcended my inauthenticity and I have had an explosion of awareness. So threatening as it might be, to be able to see myself for who I am, to be able to look at myself and understand and gently accept the games that I'm playing, the coping strategies that I use, and deepening the intimacy. And that is something we can do. I have seen this happen where just by authentic self-disclosure, I have been able to create a community of friends around me who will share at that level. And this is ways in which we can actually reduce the level of alienation that we are feeling. The third Eastern strategy that Osho talks about is moving from roboticism to awakened presence. We talked about how we have become efficient robots, getting so much accomplished. But in our pursuit of efficiency and productivity, we have lost touch with our own essence. We have become human doings and human havings, and we have lost touch with what makes us uniquely human, namely our being. Now, the Zen masters had a very simple strategy. They said, when you are lost in a paroxysm of endless efficient activity, you've got a to-do list and you're going through that to-do list. If you can pause and ask yourself, have I become a robot? Oh my God, I've become a robot. In that moment of noticing and witnessing that I've become robotic, I'm no longer a robot, because a robot is not capable of consciousness. A robot is still going about mechanically. At the moment at which I can see I'm a robot, I have transcended roboticism. I have regained the fullness of my consciousness as a human being. So just to ask myself, as many Zen masters would do, they'd say, Param, are you awake or are you being just a robot? Just the mere presence of that question 4 or 5 times a day would lead to a tremendous explosion of awareness. Ego transcendence. What separates us from each other is that we exist as individual egos. And we often engage in a number of activities that reinforces our separateness. So an ego-based consciousness will lead to more and more alienation. For example, notice how much of our life is run by the need to be right in every argument, and how happy we are when we prove somebody wrong. Notice how much we try to impress other people, as even I'm trying in this talk, right? To look good. How much of our time is spent? Somebody said 90% of the average life of a human being is spent either impressing people or complaining about other people, and that is the machine-like quality that we fall into, and our ego often takes that form. If we can recognize that when I exist as a wave, I'm an ego-based phenomenon, but the wave is a transient phenomenon. It really doesn't have any power. It's only when the wave has effaced itself, when the wave has died and dissolved into the ocean, that the wave has the power and the beauty of the ocean behind it, which means whenever I'm wrong, if I can start enjoying those instances where either the universe or a specific human being proves me to be wrong, and if I can really take delight in it, I have taken the beginning steps of ego transcendence. Another one before we end this, the presentation part, is leaving our unique signature on our institutional roles. Remember, one of the things that happen in alienation is that we have job descriptions. And as we keep enacting our job descriptions, there is less and less of us in the job. Param becomes a college professor, somebody else becomes an assembly line operator. Is there a way in which we can inject our own sense of our unique signature into the job. Many of you will remember the story that I told of the dancing policeman who was passionate about dance, and he had choreographed the essential steps of Bharatnatyam, a classical Indian dance form, into how he was guiding traffic. So notice what he did. He took something that he's deeply passionate about and intertwined it with his job, so that his job was not just a job of directing traffic, but it was a job of celebrating his love of dance. And finally, the shopping cart conundrum. I want to leave you with the shopping cart conundrum. What is the shopping cart conundrum? Osho points out that when I feel inadequate, when I have a hole inside me of inferiority, of inadequacy, my instinct is to take a shopping cart and go into the mall. I'm not referring to any specific mall, but to the mall of life, trying to accumulate credentials, certificates, honors. So I fill my shopping cart, perhaps with private jets, with big houses, with resume items, because I'm feeling inadequate inside. How many of you have known the temporary sense of relief you get when you go shopping, that excitement of going and shopping for things, whether on Amazon or in person? So it takes us away from the pain and the sense of inadequacy and the sense of futility we have about our lives. It's a momentary escape from the pain. So I build up a shopping cart full of many interesting object trophies that I've collected, diplomas that I've collected, 4 master's degrees, PhD. But notice that the shopping cart is something that's outside, and it doesn't matter how tall and high it piles up. My pain, my sense of inadequacy, my vacuum is inside. And therefore, you will find that the two never meet. No matter how much I decorate myself with achievements and embellishments, I feel a sense of emptiness, a sense of meaninglessness inside me. If I have not dealt with that inner self-hate, that inner inadequacy, and to transcend the shopping cart conundrum, the only answer is to accept ourselves as we are, to love ourselves for who we are, to celebrate ourselves for who we are. And it's only when we can accept ourselves with all our limitations that we start being able to open our hearts to our fellow human beings and love other people unconditionally. And unconditional love is the only true answer to human alienation. Now, thank you so much, folks. I want to announce next week's topic in advance. Next week's topic is called When the Shit Hits the Fan. Creative responses to personal crisis. So I'm announcing this in advance because I know that many of us have known family and friends who are dealing with or coping with sudden shock, disappointment. It could be death, divorce, it could be job loss. And in these times of crisis, I've tried to put together from the Eastern wisdom traditions a host of insights of how we can increase our resiliency when the shit hits the fan. So please, I will make sure that I send out the announcement tomorrow itself without losing time. I would like all the help that you can give me to encourage friends and associates to attend this, and to see what unusual outside the box insights can come from that presentation. So for those of you who are new, who are joining us for the first time, this is the point at which we transition. So the formal presentation is over. And if you want to leave at this point, you're welcome to do that. But usually a few people just stay on for a longer discussion that goes on for about 20 minutes or so. And we're usually very good at ending at 3. So at 3, you can hop off. I mean, you can hop off anytime, but we will stay on for about 20 minutes in discussion, interaction. And I'm going to stop the recording at this point.